I stopped keeping track after the third time someone asked me if I'd eat them when they died. Not as a joke, as a real question. Because by then, we'd all done the math, and the math didn't care how much we used to trust each other. It just kept subtracting, and we kept pretending we hadn't noticed how quiet the children's section had gotten. I don't remember when I stopped thinking of the overseer's voice as comforting. Maybe it was the third time she used the word temporary in the same breath as indefinite. Maybe it was earlier than that. The intercom crackled the way it always did. That familiar static hiss before her measured tones filled the corridors, and I was in the commissary when it happened. I had been counting the cans on the shelf behind the service window, not actively, just the way your eyes trace patterns when you're waiting, and I noticed there were fewer than last week. Not dramatically fewer. Just enough that the empty spaces had started to form their own geometry. "Good evening, Vault 47, she said, and there was that pause she always used, the one that implied we were all listening together, united in our attention. "I want to address some concerns that have been circulating regarding our current resource allocation." Resource allocation. I remember thinking that was a strange way to describe food. As you know, our hydroponic systems have been operating below optimal capacity for several months now. Our engineers have been working tirelessly to resolve the contamination issues affecting crop yields, and I am pleased to report significant progress. My eyes stayed on those empty spaces. The shelf had been full 2 months ago. I was certain of that because 2 months ago was when Chen's daughter turned 6 and there had been cake. Not real cake, but the kind we made from stored ingredients, and there had been enough for everyone to have a piece. In the meantime, we are implementing a revised rationing schedule to ensure equitable distribution while our systems return to full productivity. Your cooperation and patience during this transitional period are, as always, deeply appreciated. Transitional period, temporary, indefinite. The intercom clicked off, and I became aware of how quiet the commissary had gotten. There were maybe a dozen people scattered across the tables, and no one was looking at each other. Miller was staring at his half-finished tray, pushing reconstituted protein around with his fork in slow, deliberate circles. Across from him, Yolanda had stopped mid-bite, her mouth slightly open, and I watched her slowly lower her fork back to the tray without completing the motion. I should have felt something sharp right then, alarm, maybe, or anger, but what I felt was more like recognition. The way you feel when you finally name something that's been true for a while. The ration cuts started the next day. Not severe, just enough to notice. My breakfast went from 2 protein bars to 1.5. Dinner portions shrank by what must have been exactly calculated percentages. The kind of reduction that's defensible, mathematical. No one could point to their tray and call it starvation. Not yet. But you felt it. In the afternoons, mostly. That hollow sensation that wasn't quite hunger, but wasn't quite satisfaction either. A persistent awareness of your stomach that you couldn't ignore through distraction. I worked in maintenance, which meant I moved through the vault's circulatory system, the access tunnels and service corridors where the real infrastructure lived. Pipes that carried water, cables that carried power, ducts that carried air. I had been doing it for 11 years, long enough that my body knew the vault's layout better than my conscious mind did. I could navigate to the water reclamation facility in complete darkness, my hands finding ladder rungs and valve wheels by muscle memory alone. 3 days after the announcement, I was in the lower-level access tunnel replacing a corroded coupling when I heard voices. The tunnel branched ahead of me, and the acoustics down there were strange sounds traveled farther than they should, but arrived muffled and directionless. I couldn't make out words at first, just the rhythm of conversation, urgent and low. I kept working. It wasn't my business. But then I heard my name, or something close to it, and my hands stopped moving. Maintenance staff first, obviously. They're the ones who know where everything is. And if they refuse? A woman's voice. I thought it might be Reeves from hydroponics, but I wasn't certain. They won't refuse. They're practical people. They'll see the sense in it. I set down my wrench carefully, quietly. The coupling could wait. When? Reeves asked, if it was Reeves. Soon. Before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Before people start getting desperate. I heard footsteps then, moving away from me, and I stayed very still until the sound faded completely. Then I sat there in the tunnel, staring at the half-replaced coupling, trying to decode what I had just heard. The words felt slippery, like they meant something specific I couldn't quite grasp. Who was they? What was the it that I would supposedly see the sense in? I finished the coupling, but I took my time. My hands felt clumsy, and I had to redo the seal twice before it held properly. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk standard Vault issue, the mattress thin enough that I could feel the metal frame beneath it and listen to the air recyclers hum their endless rhythm. My neighbor above me was snoring, a wet, rattling sound that usually annoyed me but tonight felt oddly comforting. Proof of normalcy, proof that some things continued unchanged. I thought about the voices in the tunnel. I thought about the empty spaces on the commissary shelves. I thought about the word temporary and how it could stretch to mean almost anything. When I finally slept, I dreamed about numbers, endless columns of them, flickering on a terminal screen too fast to read. I kept trying to add them up, but they changed every time I got close to a total. The next morning, I noticed people counting. Not openly, not dramatically, just small, furtive gestures. Hernandez from engineering tapping his fingers against his leg as he walked past the commissary. Chen touching each ration package on her tray before she started eating, her lips moving silently. Even children were doing it. I saw a little girl, couldn't have been more than 4, arranging her food into careful piles, moving individual pieces from one side of her plate to the other with intense concentration. We had become a vault of accountants. I picked up my own ration and carried it to a table in the corner, the spot I usually claimed. The tray felt lighter than it should. I set it down and looked at what they had given me. 1 protein bar, a serving of rehydrated vegetables that might have been peas once, and a cup of something that was technically soup. The protein bar was smaller than yesterday's. I was sure of it. I ate slowly, making each bite last, and I hated myself for it, for already adapting, for already accepting that this was how things were now. Across the room, I saw Carson arguing with one of the commissary workers. His voice was rising, and people were starting to stare. "This isn't enough," he was saying, gesturing at his tray. "Look at this. This isn't enough for a child, let alone..." "Sir, I'm just following the distribution guidelines," the worker said. She was young, maybe 20, and she looked terrified. "If you have concerns, you can file a complaint with..." "A complaint? Right. I'll file a complaint." Carson laughed, and it was an ugly sound. "I'll file a complaint while I starve." 2 security officers appeared from somewhere. They didn't rush, didn't draw weapons. They just walked up to Carson with the kind of calm that suggested they had been expecting this, had maybe even been waiting for it. One of them put a hand on Carson's shoulder. "Let's take a walk," the officer said. Carson looked at that hand for a long moment. Then he looked at his tray, at the insufficient portions laid out in their regulation compartments. Then he looked at all of us, everyone in the commissary who had stopped eating to watch this unfold. "Yeah," he said finally, "let's take a walk." They led him out, and the room slowly resumed its normal sounds. Forks, scraping plates, quiet conversations, the hum of the refrigeration units behind the serving counter. I finished my meal, every bite. I even scraped the residue from the soup cup with my finger. That afternoon, I was scheduled to inspect the air filtration system in Section C. It was routine work, the kind of thing I could do while thinking about something else, and what I was thinking about was Carson. Specifically, I was wondering where they had taken him. The vault wasn't large enough for real isolation. We all saw each other eventually, in the corridors or the common areas or the bathrooms. You couldn't make someone disappear. But I realized I hadn't seen Carson in the commissary for 2 days before his outburst, and now that I thought about it, I hadn't seen Patterson in almost a week. Or Willis. Or that older woman whose name I could never remember but who always smiled at me in the corridors. I stopped walking. I was standing in a junction where 4 corridors met, and I turned slowly, looking at each passage in turn. The vault felt different suddenly. Not smaller, but more segmented. Like it had developed internal borders I hadn't noticed before. "You okay?" I turned. Malik from hydroponics was standing a few feet away, carrying a tablet and looking at me with concern. "Yeah," I said, "just tired." "Aren't we all?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You headed to Section C?" "Filtration inspection." "Right. Hey, while you're down there, could you check the humidity sensor in Bay 4? It's been giving weird readings." "Sure. I'll take a look." She thanked me and walked away, and I continued towards Section C, but my mind was still stuck on that realization about the missing people. Not missing, exactly. Just absent. Redistributed, maybe. Assigned to different shifts or different duties. The filtration room was small and hot, packed with machinery that had been running continuously for longer than I had been alive. The filters themselves were massive cylindrical units, each one taller than me, and they rotated slowly on mechanical tracks, cycling through cleaning and operation phases. The sound they made was somewhere between a hum and a grind, a noise so constant that you stopped hearing it after a few minutes. I checked the gauges, made notes on my tablet, and then moved to Bay 4 to look at Malik's sensor. It was mounted on the wall near one of the growing trays, and when I pulled the cover off, I immediately saw the problem. Corrosion had eaten through part of the wiring, leaving exposed copper that had oxidized to a dull green. I was replacing the corroded section when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the rhythmic machinery noise, voices, again, coming from somewhere beyond the wall I was working on. I pressed my ear against the metal. It was cool and slightly damp, and the sound clarified into distinct words. "Can't sustain this. The numbers don't work." "The numbers work if we adjust the parameters." "Adjust the parameters? You mean reduce head count?" A pause. "Then, I mean optimize resource distribution to ensure long-term viability." "That's the same thing." "It's the only thing, unless you have a better solution." I pulled my ear away from the wall. My heart was beating too fast, and my hands had started to shake. I looked at the exposed wiring in front of me, at the green oxidation, and I thought about how rust is just metal eating itself, slow dissolution, inevitable decay. I finished the repair mechanically, sealed the housing, and left Bay 4. I didn't go back to the filtration room. I went to my quarters instead, even though my shift wasn't over, and I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about what optimized resource distribution meant when you ran out of resources to distribute. The cuts deepened, not all at once, gradually, like the turning of a screw. One day your protein bar was a little smaller. The next day your vegetable serving had fewer pieces. The soup became thinner, more water than substance. And we adapted. That was the horrible part, how quickly we adapted. People started eating slower, making meals last. Conversations in the commissary became shorter as everyone focused on their trays with singular intensity. You learned to eat everything, even the parts you would have discarded before. The slightly burnt edges, the bits that didn't taste quite right. Nothing was wasted now. I started noticing other changes too. The way people looked at each other. Not hostile, exactly, but evaluative. I caught myself doing it, glancing at someone and unconsciously cataloging their body type, their muscle mass, their apparent health, calculating who could afford to lose a little weight and who couldn't. We were turning into assessors, appraisers of flesh. There was a meeting, mandatory attendance. They held it in the common area, which was the only space large enough for everyone, and when I arrived, the room was already crowded with bodies. The air was warm and close, thick with the smell of too many people breathing in an enclosed space. The overseer stood on a small platform at the front. She looked tired, I thought. Or maybe I was just projecting. Maybe I wanted her to look tired, wanted proof that this was affecting her too. "Thank you all for coming," she said, and the room gradually quieted. "I know these past few weeks have been difficult. I know you have questions and concerns, and you deserve answers." She paused, and in that pause, I heard someone cough, a dry, hacking sound that went on too long. "The situation with our hydroponic systems is more complex than we initially assessed," the overseer continued. "The contamination has proven resistant to our remediation efforts, and we have made the difficult decision to shut down 2 of our 3 growing bays for complete decontamination and replanting." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not quite panic, but close to it. "This will be a temporary setback," she said, raising her voice slightly. "But in the short term, it means our fresh food production will be operating at approximately 30% capacity." 30%. The number hung in the air like smoke. "Our stored rations, combined with reduced production, will sustain us for approximately 8 to 10 months. During that time, we will continue working to restore full hydroponics functionality and explore alternative food production methods." 8 to 10 months. I did the math automatically. That took us to late fall, maybe early winter. And after that? She didn't say. She didn't have to. "I am implementing additional conservation measures effective immediately," the overseer said. "All non-essential personnel will be reassigned to food production support. Recreation schedules will be reduced. And, regrettably, individual rations will be further adjusted to extend our supply timeline." Further adjusted. I thought about my breakfast that morning, 3/4 of a protein bar and a cup of water, and tried to imagine what further adjustment would look like. "I know this is hard," the overseer said, and for the first time, her voice wavered slightly. "I know you're scared, but we have weathered crises before. We are vault dwellers. We endure, we survive, and we will get through this together." Together. The word felt hollow. We weren't together. We were individuals sharing increasingly scarce resources in a sealed container. And every day the container felt a little smaller. The meeting ended, and people dispersed slowly, reluctantly. No one wanted to leave, I realized, because leaving meant going back to our separate routines, our separate hungers. Here, at least, we were still collective in our anxiety. I found myself walking beside Tomas from engineering. We had worked together a few times, shared meals occasionally. He was a big man, solid and strong, the kind of person you wanted on your team when there was heavy lifting involved. 10 months, he said, not looking at me. "If we're lucky," I replied. "Yeah, if we're lucky." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "You ever think about what happens after?" After 10 months, after the food runs out completely. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. "They must have a plan," Tomas said, "right? They must have thought about this, made contingencies." "Sure," I said. "I'm sure they have." But I wasn't sure. Not at all. That night I dreamed about the tunnel again. But this time I was crawling through it, and it kept getting narrower, the walls pressing in from both sides. I could see light ahead, but no matter how far I crawled, it never got closer. And behind me, I could hear footsteps. Someone was following me, and they were moving faster than I was. I woke up with my heart racing, and my sheets soaked with sweat. The air in my quarters felt thick and insufficient, and I lay there breathing deliberately, counting each inhalation and exhalation until my pulse slowed. 4 months. That's how long it took for the first person to die. His name was Rodriguez, and he worked in the reactor section. I didn't know him well, just to nod at in the corridors, but everyone knew what happened. He collapsed during his shift, just fell over mid-task, and by the time medical got to him, he was gone. The official announcement said it was a heart condition, undiagnosed, unrelated to current circumstances, a tragic coincidence. But I saw Rodriguez 2 weeks before he died. I saw him in the commissary, saw the way his clothes hung loose on his frame, saw the hollow places beneath his eyes. I saw him eating his ration with the same careful intensity as the rest of us, making every bite count. Heart condition, maybe, Or maybe his heart just couldn't keep running on insufficient fuel. They held a memorial service in the common area, short, dignified. The overseer spoke about service and sacrifice, about how Rodriguez had been a dedicated member of the Vault community, about how we would honor his memory by continuing to work together, to support each other, to endure. I stood in the back and watched people cry, real tears, genuine grief. But underneath the grief, I could see something else. I could see people doing the same calculation I was doing. One less person, one less mouth to feed, one less share of the remaining supplies to distribute. And I hated myself for thinking it. But I couldn't stop thinking it. The mathematics of survival had begun to reshape our psychology. Work became different, quieter, more tense. People still performed their duties. The vault required constant maintenance to remain habitable, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were shorter, more transactional. No one lingered in the corridors anymore. You went where you needed to go, did what you needed to do, and returned to your quarters. Privacy became valuable in a new way, not because you wanted to be alone, but because being alone meant no one was watching you. No one was judging how much water you used in the shower, or how long you spent in the bathroom, or whether you had an extra pack of rations hidden somewhere. I started keeping a journal. Not on the terminal, too permanent, too traceable, but in an actual notebook I found in a storage closet, pre-war paper that was yellowed and brittle but still functional. I wrote in it late at night, by the dim light of my bedside lamp, and I documented everything. The ration sizes, the meetings, the conversations I overheard, the changes I noticed in people's behavior. I wasn't sure why I was doing it. Maybe I thought someone would need a record someday. Maybe I just needed to externalize what was happening so it didn't consume me from the inside. Or maybe I was just trying to maintain some sense of order in a situation that was becoming increasingly chaotic. The second death happened 3 weeks after Rodriguez. An older woman named Chen, not related to Chen from medical, different Chen who had been sick for a while. Pneumonia, they said. But I remembered seeing her in the commissary the day before she died, remembered how thin she had gotten, how her hands shook when she lifted her water cup. 2 deaths, 2 fewer people, 2 more shares redistributed among the survivors. And I caught myself thinking, how much difference does that make? 2 people worth of food over 10 months. Was it days, hours, minutes? I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. The overseer called another meeting. Same place, same platform, but the crowd was noticeably smaller this time. Not just because of the deaths, but because people were avoiding gatherings. The effort of getting to the common area, the expenditure of energy, it was too costly when you were running on insufficient calories. I have important news, the overseer said. She looked worse than last time. Her skin had a gray quality to it, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Our engineering team has developed a potential solution to our food production crisis. A ripple of reaction went through the crowd. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. The possibility of hope. We have identified a section of the Vault Level D, sections 12 through 18, that can be retrofitted for emergency hydroponics. The space is currently used for storage, but with significant modification, we believe we can establish a functional growing environment. She paused, and I could see her choosing her next words carefully. The modification will require a substantial diversion of resources, power primarily. We will need to redirect approximately 40% of our current electrical allocation to support the new growing systems, which means implementing rolling blackouts in residential and recreational areas. 40%. I thought about my quarters, about the lamp I used to write in my journal, about the climate control that kept the air breathable. 40% meant hours of darkness, hours of cold, hours of sitting in your bunk with nothing to do but think about how hungry you were. I know this will be difficult, the overseer continued, but the alternative is significantly worse. The alternative is running out of food entirely before we can restore primary hydroponics. This gives us a chance. A real chance at sustainability. Someone in the crowd raised a hand. How long until the new system is operational? Optimistically, 6 weeks. Realistically, 2 to 3 months. And until then, we're in the dark? Partial darkness, yes, but not completely. Essential systems will remain online. Medical, life support, security. We're not sacrificing safety. We're sacrificing comfort. Another voice, from the back. What about the people working on the retrofit? They'll need extra rations, won't they, for the physical labor? The overseer hesitated. Just for a moment, but I saw it. Yes, she said. The retrofit crew will receive supplemental nutrition to maintain work capacity. The room erupted, not violently, but loudly. People shouting questions, objections, accusations. The overseer tried to speak over them, tried to restore order, but the collective anger was too strong. I stood there and watched it happen and felt nothing. Or not nothing, exactly. I felt distant, like I was observing from somewhere outside my body. Because I understood the logic. Of course, the workers needed more food. They were burning more calories. They were essential to the survival project. It made perfect sense. But sense didn't make it fair. And fairness didn't make it easier to accept. The meeting dissolved into chaos, and eventually, security had to intervene, herding people out of the common area in groups. I left with the others, and I walked back to my quarters in silence, and I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about supplemental nutrition. Supplemental nutrition for some, further reductions for others. The Vault was developing a hierarchy based on usefulness. They announced the retrofit crew assignments the next day, posted them on the main terminal in the corridor outside the commissary where everyone would see them. 30 names, all maintenance and engineering personnel, all young to middle-aged, all physically capable. My name was on the list. I stood there reading it, reading my own name among the others, and I felt a complicated surge of emotion. Relief that I would get extra food, guilt that I was relieved, fear about what the work would entail, shame that I wasn't refusing, wasn't objecting to the inequity. But more than any of that, I felt resignation. Because I knew I was going to do it. I was going to take the assignment and eat the extra rations and not think too hard about the people who wouldn't be getting them, because I wanted to survive. And survival required compromise. The work was brutal. We cleared out Level D first, hauling decades of accumulated storage up to the sorting area where it could be catalogued and redistributed. Most of it was junk, broken equipment, obsolete supplies, pre-war artifacts that had seemed important once but served no function now. We worked in teams, loading carts and pushing them through the corridors, our muscles burning and our lungs heaving in the inadequate air. But we were fed. Twice a day, they gave us extra rations. Not luxury meals, not abundance, but enough that the sharp edge of hunger dulled slightly. Enough that you could work without feeling like your body was consuming itself. The rest of the Vault noticed, of course. You could see it in the way they looked at us. We were the fed ones, the chosen ones, the collaborators. I tried not to meet anyone's eyes in the commissary. Tomas was on the crew too, and we worked together most days. He had gotten thinner, we all had, but he was still strong, still capable. We didn't talk much while we worked. Talking required energy we didn't have. But sometimes, during breaks, we would sit against the wall and share observations. "You notice how quiet it's getting," he said one day. I had noticed. The Vault's ambient sound had changed. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps. Even the children had stopped playing in the corridors. "People are conserving energy," I said. "Yeah, or they're too weak to make noise." We sat there in silence for a while, and then Tomas said, "You ever think about leaving?" "Leaving?" "The Vault, going up, taking our chances on the surface." I looked at him. "You're serious?" "Why not? What's the worst that can happen? We die, we're dying here anyway, just slower. The radiation might not be as bad as they told us. You ever think about that? That maybe the whole uninhabitable surface thing is exaggerated, a way to keep us controlled? I hadn't thought about it. Not seriously. The Vault doctrine was clear. The surface was death. Radiation, mutated creatures, roving raiders. You went up, you didn't come back. But Tomas had a point. We only had the Vault's word for it. None of us had ever seen the surface. None of us knew what was really up there. Even if it's not as bad as they say, I told him, it's not better than here. This is shelter, water, air, structure. For now, Tomas said, but what about 6 months from now? What about when the food runs out completely? I didn't have an answer for that. The retrofit took longer than projected. 8 weeks, then 10, then 12. The new hydroponics bay was more complex than anticipated, requiring systems that had to be fabricated from scratch. We worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, and even with the extra rations, I could feel my body deteriorating. My muscles ached constantly. My joints felt loose and unstable. I developed a cough that wouldn't go away. But we kept working. Because stopping meant losing the extra food, and losing the extra food meant joining the ranks of the truly hungry. The truly hungry were everywhere now. You saw them in the corridors, moving slowly, mechanically. You saw them in the commissary, eating their reduced rations with a kind of desperate precision, making sure not a single crumb was lost. You saw them in their quarters, lying on their bunks during the rolling blackouts, conserving every possible calorie. The children were the worst to see. They had stopped growing. Some of them had started shrinking. I passed a little girl one day, couldn't have been more than 6, and she looked at me with eyes that were too large for her face, too aware. She knew what was happening. They all knew. Death became routine. Not common, exactly, but regular enough that it stopped feeling shocking. Someone would collapse during their shift, or they would fail to wake up one morning, and there would be a brief announcement, a brief memorial, and then life continued. The Vault swallowed death and kept functioning. We became efficient at grief, quick, clean, minimal. I stopped writing in my journal. I told myself it was because I was too tired, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I didn't want to document what was happening anymore. I didn't want to preserve this. I wanted it to dissolve into vague, unmemorable past. The retrofit bay finally came online in week 16. They held a small ceremony, nothing elaborate, just the overseer saying a few words about perseverance and hope, and then we activated the systems and watched the lights flicker on, watched the water begin to flow through the irrigation channels, watched the carefully planted seeds sitting in their growing trays under the artificial sun. 8 to 10 weeks until first harvest, the overseer said. Assuming optimal growth conditions. 8 to 10 weeks, plus the 16 weeks we had already burned. That was nearly 6 months total. We were supposed to have 8 to 10 months of supplies. That meant we were past the halfway point. I looked at the fragile seedlings in their trays and tried to feel hopeful, tried to see salvation in those tiny green shoots. But all I could think was, what if it's not enough? What if they don't grow fast enough, or don't produce enough, or die from some unforeseen contamination? What if we did all of this for nothing? The extra rations stopped as soon as the retrofit was complete. One day I was getting supplemental nutrition, the next day I was back to standard portions. The transition was abrupt and difficult. My body had adjusted to the higher caloric intake, and suddenly cutting back felt like starvation all over again. But I couldn't complain. I had been fed while others weren't. I had maintained my strength while others deteriorated. I had no right to object. So I didn't. I just accepted it and went back to my regular duties and tried not to think about how much harder everything had become. The blackouts continued, 4 hours of darkness each day, rotating through different sections of the vault, so the burden was shared. During those hours, you sat in your quarters with nothing to do. No light to read by, no power for the terminal, just you and the dark and the sound of your own breathing. I discovered that hunger is worse in the dark. When you can't see, can't distract yourself, can't engage with the world, Your body's needs become overwhelming. The emptiness in your stomach expands to fill your entire awareness. I started sleeping during the blackouts, or trying to. Sleep was difficult. Your body needed calories to sleep properly, but it was better than lying awake in the dark, thinking about food. I had dreams about eating, vivid, detailed dreams where I was at a table laden with abundance. Real meat, fresh vegetables, bread that was actually soft. I would eat and eat and eat, and I would feel satisfied, genuinely full. And then I would wake up, and the satisfaction would vanish instantly, leaving me more hollow than before. Those dreams were cruel, but I couldn't stop having them. 12 weeks after the retrofit bay activation, the first shoots were ready for harvest. Not a full crop, just the early greens that matured fastest. They brought them to the commissary with ceremony, displayed them on the serving counter like prizes. The portions were small, tiny, really. A few leaves of lettuce per person. A couple stalks of something that might have been kale, but it was fresh, it was real. It was food that had been grown, not just reconstituted from stored powder. I ate mine slowly, reverently. The taste was incredible, sharp and alive, and nothing like the bland rations I had been consuming. Each bite was a reminder of what food could be, should be. But when I finished, I looked at my tray and realized that the fresh vegetables had replaced part of my normal ration. The total amount of food was the same. They had just redistributed the composition. It wasn't abundance, it was theater. I saw the overseer later that day, walking through the corridors with 2 security officers flanking her. She looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time. She saw me watching and nodded, a brief acknowledgement. Then she continued past. I wondered if she was eating the same rations as the rest of us. I wondered if she lay awake in the dark during the blackouts, feeling her stomach contract. I wondered if she had dreams about food. Probably not. Leaders always had reserves, always had contingencies. That was the nature of hierarchy. The weeks blurred together. Work, eat, sleep. Work, eat, sleep. The routine was numbing, which was maybe a mercy. When you stopped thinking about the future, when you stopped counting days or calculating odds, existence became simpler, mechanical. But you couldn't stop completely. Some part of your brain kept running the numbers, kept tracking the slow depletion of resources, kept watching other people waste away and wondering when your turn would come. The third growing bay, the one they had shut down for decontamination, came back online, but the yields were lower than expected. Some kind of persistent contamination that the engineers couldn't fully eliminate. The plants grew, but they were weak, prone to disease. We got maybe 60% of normal production. Better than nothing, but not enough. I started noticing changes in my own body. My hair was falling out. Not dramatically, not in clumps, but every morning there were strands on my pillow. My skin had become dry and papery, and I bruised easily. Small impacts that should have been nothing left dark marks that took weeks to fade. My gums bled when I brushed my teeth. My fingernails had started to develop ridges. I was falling apart slowly, cellular by cellular. We all were. Thomas approached me one day after shift. We were in the corridor outside the engineering bay, and he looked around carefully before speaking, making sure no one was in earshot. "I'm doing it," he said quietly. "Doing what?" "Leaving. Going up. I've been talking to some others. We're going to try the surface." I stared at him. "That's insane." "No. What's insane is staying here and waiting to die. At least up there we have a chance." "A chance at what? Radiation poisoning? Being torn apart by whatever lives up there now? Maybe. Or maybe we find another vault. Another settlement. Maybe there are people surviving up there who have food, who have resources. Or maybe you die in the first hour." Thomas shrugged. "At least it'll be quick." I wanted to argue with him, wanted to list all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But looking at him, at the determination in his eyes, I realized he had already made up his mind. He wasn't asking for my approval. He was saying goodbye. When? I asked. 3 days. Middle of the night shift, during the blackout. They're not watching the vault door as carefully anymore. Too few security personnel, too many other problems. How many of you? 6, maybe 7. We haven't finalized everyone. They'll kill you if they catch you trying to open the door. Probably. But they can't kill us if we're quick enough. We stood there in silence for a moment, and then Tomas extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was weak, his palm clammy. Good luck, I said. You too. You'll need it, staying here. He walked away, and I watched him go, and I thought about what he had said, about chances, about choices, about quick deaths versus slow ones. That night I lay in my bunk during the blackout and considered going with them. Really considered it. Imagined myself at the vault door, climbing the stairs, emerging into whatever waited above. But I didn't, because I was afraid. Not of the surface. I was beyond caring about radiation or mutants or raiders. I was afraid of the choice itself, of committing to action instead of passive endurance. So I stayed in my bunk, and I listened to the darkness, and I hated myself for my cowardice. 3 days later, I woke to alarms, loud, piercing sounds that cut through the morning quiet, people shouting in the corridors, running footsteps. I got dressed quickly and stepped out of my quarters. The corridor was chaos, people streaming toward the main atrium, security officers pushing against the flow, trying to restore order. I grabbed someone's arm as they passed. What happened? The vault door. Someone tried to open it. Tomas. He had done it. Or tried to. I followed the crowd to the atrium. The overseer was there, standing on the same platform she had used for the meetings, and her face was rigid with anger. 7 members of this vault attempted to breach our primary entrance, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. They tried to compromise our security, to expose us all to whatever dangers exist outside these walls. 7, not 6. They had found one more person willing to risk it. They were stopped by our security personnel. Stopped before they could endanger this entire community. Stopped. The word hung heavy. What happened to them? Someone shouted from the crowd. The overseer's expression didn't change. They are currently detained. They will face appropriate consequences for their actions. What consequences? Another voice. What are you going to do to them? That is a matter for the Vault Authority to determine. The crowd erupted in objections, questions, demands, but the overseer just stood there, impassive, until security moved in to disperse everyone. I left with the others, but I didn't go back to my quarters. I went to the detention area, a small section near the security office where they kept the few cells we had. There were guards outside, and they wouldn't let me pass. I need to see Tomas, I said. Please, just for a minute. No visitors, the guard said. He was young, maybe 22, and he looked uncomfortable. Orders from the overseer. I just want to make sure he's okay. He's fine. They're all fine. They're just detained until the overseer decides what to do with them. I started to argue, but the guard's hand moved to his weapon, not threateningly, just a reminder that he had it, and I realized there was no point. I walked away. They held a trial. Not formal, not legal, but a trial nonetheless. The overseer presiding, a small jury of senior Vault members, and the 7 attempted escapees standing in a line, looking exhausted and defiant. The charges were simple: attempted breach of Vault security, endangerment of the community, violation of core Vault regulations. The defense was equally simple: starvation, desperation, the basic human right to try to survive. I sat in the back and watched it unfold. Watched the overseer present her case with calm precision. Watched the defendants argue for their actions with varying degrees of eloquence. Watched the jury deliberate for 30 minutes before returning with a verdict. Guilty, all 7 of them. The sentence: permanent expulsion from the vault. A murmur ran through the crowd. Not shock, we had all expected something severe, but recognition. They were going to get what they wanted. in the worst possible way. "You will be given basic supplies," the overseer said. "Water, minimal rations, radiation protection if available. You will be escorted to the entrance and released to the surface. You will not be permitted to return under any circumstances." Thomas was staring at the overseer with something like hatred, pure, concentrated hatred. "We were leaving anyway," he said. "This isn't punishment. This is just you pretending you have control." "This is me protecting the people who choose to stay," the overseer replied, "who honor their commitment to this community. This community is dying. We're all dying. We just chose to die on our own terms." The overseer didn't respond. She just gestured to the security officers, and they led the 7 away. The executions happened the next day. That's what they were, really, even if they called it expulsion. Sending people to the surface with minimal supplies was death, just slower and lonelier than a bullet. They didn't let anyone watch. The procedure happened during a scheduled blackout behind closed doors. But I heard about it afterward. Heard how they marched the 7 to the vault entrance. How they gave them each a small pack of supplies. How they opened the door just wide enough for people to slip through. How Tomas had looked back at the vault one last time before stepping into the darkness beyond. How the door had sealed behind them with the finality of a tomb. I thought about him out there, climbing the stairs, emerging into whatever wasteland waited above. I thought about whether he would last days or hours. I thought about whether he regretted his choice. But mostly I thought about how he had been right, about control, about dying on your own terms. Because the rest of us didn't have that. We had yielded control completely, had placed our survival in the hands of systems and authorities and hope, and in exchange for that surrender, we got to die slowly, together, in the dark. The vault changed after the expulsion, became quieter, more tense. People stopped talking about the surface, stopped questioning the overseer's decisions. We had seen what happened to questioners. But the silence wasn't compliance. It was fear. Fear that if you spoke up, if you showed doubt, you would be next. The vault had developed an immune system, and it was purging threats. The harvests from the retrofit bay continued, but they weren't enough. We were producing food, yes, but not at replacement rate. Every meal we ate drew down our stored supplies a little further. The trajectory was clear to anyone who could do basic math. We were still starving, just more slowly now. I stopped weighing myself. There was a scale in the medical bay, and I had been tracking my weight out of morbid curiosity, watching the numbers drop week by week. But it became too depressing, too concrete, so I stopped. I could feel the weight loss anyway, in how my clothes fit, in how my ribs had started to show through my skin, in how my face had become angular, my cheeks hollow. I looked like a different person. We all did. The children were dying. Not all of them, not quickly, but the mortality rate among the youngest Vault members was climbing. Their bodies couldn't handle the deprivation the way adults could. They needed more nutrients for growth, and they weren't getting them. Parents became hollow-eyed and desperate. I saw a woman in the corridor one day, carrying her daughter who looked maybe 4 years old, and the child was so thin I could see the outline of her skull beneath her skin. The mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, but she kept walking, kept carrying the child toward medical. I didn't ask if the girl made it. I didn't want to know. Deaths were announced in batches now. Once a week, the overseer would post names on the terminal. No more individual memorials, no more ceremonies, just names and dates, and the word deceased. I started recognizing names, people I had worked with, people I had eaten beside in the commissary, people whose faces I could picture, but whose stories I had never learned. They were all stories now. Past tense, finished. I wondered when my name would appear on that list. The overseer called a meeting. I almost didn't go. Meetings felt pointless now, just another venue for receiving bad news, but something compelled me. Maybe habit. Maybe the faint, irrational hope that this time would be different. The common area was half empty. people were too weak to attend or had stopped caring about official pronouncements. Those of us who came sat scattered across the space, leaving large gaps between individuals. The overseer looked worse than I had ever seen her. Her uniform hung loose, her skin had a waxy quality, and when she spoke, her voice lacked its usual authority. "I will not lie to you," she began. "Our situation is critical. Our stored rations are nearly exhausted. The hydroponics bays are producing below projected yields. And our population," she paused, seemed to gather herself. "Our population is declining at an unsustainable rate." No one reacted. We already knew all of this. I have consulted with our remaining engineers and medical staff, and we have developed a proposal. A difficult proposal, but potentially our only path to long-term survival. She pulled up a display on the terminal behind her. Charts and numbers I couldn't quite read from where I was sitting. "We need to reduce our population to match our food production capacity," she said. "Voluntarily." The word hung in the air. Voluntarily. "We are asking for volunteers to enter into medically supervised end-of-life procedures, painless, dignified. In exchange, we will provide additional rations to the families of volunteers. A legacy allocation that could make the difference between survival and starvation for those who remain." Someone laughed. A short, bitter sound that echoed in the near-empty room. "You're asking us to kill ourselves," they said, "for food credits." "I'm asking you to save your families," the overseer replied, "to give them a chance when you might not have one anyway." "Who decides who's expendable?" Another voice. "Who gets to live and who gets asked to die?" "No one is being asked to die. We're offering a choice." "You're offering starvation as the alternative to suicide. That's not a choice." The overseer's composure cracked slightly. "What would you have me do? Watch everyone die slowly? Watch children waste away while we pretend there's enough for everyone? This isn't about worth. It's about mathematics. We have X amount of food and Y number of people, and those numbers don't work. So change the numbers," someone said. "Find more food. Fix the hydroponics, something other than culling the population like we're livestock. If there was another option, I would take it. I have been searching for another option for months. This is what we have." The meeting dissolved into arguments. Some people defending the proposal as pragmatic, others denouncing it as murder. The overseer tried to maintain order but eventually gave up and just stood there, silent, while we shouted ourselves into exhaustion. I didn't say anything. I just sat and listened and thought about the word voluntarily and what it meant when all your options were variations of death. 3 days later, the first volunteer was announced. An older man named Harris who had been sick for weeks. He left behind a wife and a granddaughter, and in exchange for his voluntary end of life, they received double rations for a month. They held a brief ceremony. Harris was already unconscious. They had sedated him, I assumed, and they brought him to medical on a stretcher. The overseer said some words about sacrifice and community. His wife held his hand, and then he was gone, and his family had extra food, and life continued. Over the next 2 weeks, 6 more people volunteered, all of them older or sick, all of them with families who needed the extra rations, and we normalized it. That was the horrifying part. How quickly it became just another aspect of Vault life. Someone would announce they were volunteering, there would be a small ceremony, and then they would disappear into medical and never come out. We even developed a euphemism for it, making the choice. As in, "Did you hear? Patterson is making the choice next week." As if it was neutral, as if it was really voluntary. But I saw the way people looked at the older residents now, the calculation in their eyes. I saw families having quiet, tense conversations in corners. I saw the pressure being applied, subtle and relentless. If you were old, if you were sick, if you were perceived as less productive, you became a candidate, whether you wanted to be or not. The Vault was eating itself to survive. I started having panic attacks. They came without warning, sudden, overwhelming waves of terror that left me gasping and shaking. My heart would race, my vision would narrow, and I would become convinced that I was dying right then, that my body was finally giving out. The attacks would pass eventually, leaving me exhausted and hollow, but they kept coming. Sometimes, multiple times a day. I went to medical once, thinking maybe they could give me something for it, but the doctor, a tired woman named Reeves who looked like she hadn't slept in months, just shook her head. "Anxiety is a symptom of malnutrition," she said. "Your brain isn't getting enough nutrients to regulate stress response. I could prescribe something, but we're conserving medication for more critical needs. So I just have to live with it? We all have to live with it. Find coping strategies, breathing exercises, distraction. But no, there's no pharmaceutical solution I can offer you." I left medical and went back to my quarters and lay on my bunk and practiced breathing. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. The rhythm was supposed to calm the nervous system. It didn't work, but I kept doing it anyway. The months blurred. Time stopped feeling linear and started feeling cyclical. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Wake, work, eat, sleep. The same routine endlessly repeated, each iteration slightly worse than the last. I stopped seeing people I recognized. Not because they had died, though many had, but because I had stopped registering faces. Everyone looked the same now. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving through the corridors like ghosts. We were all becoming interchangeable in our misery. The overseer announced that we had reached equilibrium. Our food production now matched our consumption rate. We would no longer be drawing down stored supplies. We could survive indefinitely at current population levels. She said it like it was good news, like we should celebrate. But I did the math. Current population levels meant we had lost more than 1/3 of the Vault's original population. Died from malnutrition, disease, or voluntary end-of-life procedures. Equilibrium meant we had sacrificed enough people to balance the equation. I thought about Tomas, somewhere on the surface or more likely dead. I thought about how he had called this place a tomb. He had been more right than he knew. We weren't surviving in the vault. We were being preserved, kept technically alive, but fundamentally dead. I started thinking about volunteering. Not seriously, not with real intent, but the thought would drift through my mind during the blackouts. How much easier it would be to just stop, to make the choice and let go, and not have to endure anymore. But I never did it. Some stubborn, irrational part of me kept functioning, kept moving through the routines, kept eating the insufficient rations and doing the required work. I survived because I didn't know how to do anything else. The Vault established new protocols, mandatory wellness checks, productivity assessments, quarterly evaluations of each resident's contribution to community sustainability. They didn't call it a purge, they called it optimization. But I saw what it was. I saw the older residents getting flagged as low productivity. I saw the sick being categorized as resource-intensive. I saw the framework being built for deciding who was valuable enough to keep feeding. They didn't force anyone, not directly. But they made the alternative so uncomfortable, so socially isolating, that volunteering became the path of least resistance. We had industrialized suicide and called it compassion. I received a notice that I was scheduled for evaluation. Standard procedure, they said. Nothing to worry about, just a routine assessment of my physical condition and work capacity. I went to the appointment with a sense of dread. The evaluator was a man I didn't recognize, someone from administration, probably, and he had me perform a series of physical tests. Lifting, carrying, walking on a treadmill while monitoring my heart rate. I failed most of them. My strength had deteriorated too much. My endurance was minimal. "You're showing significant muscular atrophy," the evaluator said, making notes on his tablet. "Cardiovascular capacity is below threshold. Cognitive function appears normal, but response time is delayed." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means you're currently rated as moderate productivity." We'll reassess in 3 months to determine if your condition improves or continues to decline. And if it declines, the evaluator looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Then we'll discuss your options. Options. The word had lost all meaning. I went back to my quarters and lay on my bunk and thought about those 3 months. Thought about how I could possibly improve my condition when I was already giving everything I had just to maintain basic function. I couldn't work harder. I couldn't eat more. There was no path to improvement, only managed decline. The evaluation was a countdown, a timer marking how long I had before I became expendable. I started seeing patterns everywhere. In the way people walked, in the timing of the blackouts, in the sequence of names on the deceased list. I couldn't tell if the patterns were real or if my malnourished brain was inventing order where none existed, but they felt real. They felt significant. I mentioned it to someone once, a woman I sometimes worked with, and she looked at me with concern. "You should talk to medical," she said. "That sounds like paranoia." Maybe it was. Or maybe I was seeing the Vault's true structure for the first time. The hidden systems that governed who lived and who died. Either way, I stopped talking about it. The hydroponics bay developed a new problem. Some kind of fungal infection that spread through the retrofit bay, killing entire rows of plants. They tried to contain it, tried to treat it, but it was persistent. Production dropped by 30%, which meant rations dropped by 30%, which meant we were below equilibrium again. The overseer called a meeting, but I didn't go. I couldn't bear to hear more bad news delivered in her calm, reasonable voice. Couldn't bear to watch her explain why we needed to sacrifice more people to maintain the mathematics of survival. I heard about it later from someone who had attended. They were asking for more volunteers. Urgent volunteers. They needed to reduce the population quickly to match the new production levels. And if there weren't enough volunteers, they would implement mandatory assessments, mandatory reassignments, mandatory culling. The Vault had run out of euphemisms. I sat in my quarters during the blackout and thought about the choice I was facing. I could volunteer and get it over with quickly, or I could wait for the assessment and risk being forced anyway. Or I could try to escape, try to reach the surface like Thomas had. All of them were variations of death. The only variable was timing and method. I fell asleep thinking about it and woke up having made no decision, just the same paralysis that had defined my entire existence in the Vault. The inability to choose, to act, to do anything but endure. Days passed. I kept working, kept eating my shrinking rations, kept moving through the routines. I stopped counting the deceased, stopped reading the names. It was too depressing, too overwhelming. I existed in a kind of fog, present but not engaged, alive but not living. Then one morning, I woke up and couldn't get out of bed. Not because I was too weak, though I was weak, but because I couldn't find a reason to. The routine had finally broken under its own weight. I lay there for hours, through my scheduled shift, through mealtime, through the blackout. No one came looking for me, no one noticed I was missing. And that's when I understood the final truth of the Vault. We weren't a community anymore. We weren't even individuals. We were just biological functions in a failing system, consuming resources, producing waste, gradually winding down towards cessation. The Vault would keep running after I died, would keep making its calculations, implementing its protocols, optimizing for survival. My absence would be noted, recorded, and adjusted for. I wouldn't be missed. I would just be math. I thought about getting up. Thought about going to medical and volunteering, making it official, but I couldn't summon the energy. So I stayed in my bunk, and I closed my eyes, and I let the fog deepen. I don't know how long I lay there. Time had stopped meaning much, but eventually I heard my door open, footsteps approaching. "You missed your shift." I opened my eyes. A security officer was standing beside my bunk, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I know," I said. "You need to come with me." "Where?" "Administration." You're being reassessed." I sat up slowly. My body felt heavy, uncooperative. "I'm not going to pass the assessment." "That's not your decision to make." The officer helped me stand, actually helped me, supporting my weight, and walked me through the corridors to the administration section. The vault looked different somehow, emptier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just noticing the emptiness for the first time. They put me in a small room with a chair and a terminal. The evaluator from before came in, along with someone I didn't recognize. They asked me questions, ran tests, made notes. Then they left me alone for what felt like hours. When they came back, the evaluator's expression was neutral. "You're being reclassified as low productivity," he said, "which means you have 3 options. 1. Volunteer for end-of-life procedures and provide legacy rations to a designated family member. 2. Accept reassignment to minimal resource status, which means reduced rations and restricted access to facilities. 3. Request surface expulsion. 3 ways to die." That's what he was offering me. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. 24 hours. "After that, we'll make the decision for you." They let me go back to my quarters. I sat on my bunk and stared at the wall and thought about my options. Legacy rations for a family member. But I didn't have family. Everyone I had been close to was already dead or gone. Minimal resource status, starving even more slowly than I already was. Becoming a ghost haunting the vault's corridors until my body finally quit. Surface expulsion, unknown variables, radiation, mutants, raiders, or possibly nothing. Possibly just wasteland and wind and a different kind of slow death. I pulled out my journal. I hadn't written in it for months, and I read through the entries from the beginning. My observations about the ration cuts, the meetings, the deaths, the gradual erosion of everything that had made this place feel like a community. It was all there, the whole descent documented in my cramped handwriting. I wondered if anyone would ever read it. Probably not. It would be recycled when I died, the paper repurposed for something more useful. But I kept writing anyway. This final entry, this attempt to make sense of what I had lived through, because I realized something sitting there in my quarters, reading my own words. I hadn't just survived, I had witnessed. I had paid attention. I had seen how systems fail, how communities fracture, how people become numbers in an equation. And maybe that was worth something. Maybe bearing witness was its own form of resistance against the vault's grinding logic. Or maybe I was just trying to find meaning where there was none. The blackout started. The lights dimmed and then cut out completely, leaving me in darkness. I sat there and listened to the silence, not complete silence, never complete in the vault, but the low hum of essential systems, the distant sound of ventilation, the occasional footstep in the corridor outside. I thought about Tomas climbing those stairs to the surface. I thought about what he might have found up there. I thought about whether he had regretted his choice in the end. I thought about choice itself, about how the vault had stripped away our agency piece by piece until all we had left were variations of surrender. I fell asleep in the darkness, and when I woke, the lights were back on, and I had made my decision. I went to administration and told them I was choosing surface expulsion. The officer who took my statement looked surprised. "You understand what that means? We can't guarantee your safety outside, can't guarantee there's anything survivable up there." "I understand. And you'd rather risk that than accept reduced rations or voluntary procedures?" "I'd rather die trying to find something different than die maintaining the status quo." The officer made notes. "We'll schedule your expulsion for tomorrow morning. You'll be given basic supplies, water, minimal rations, radiation protection if we have it. Once you leave, you cannot return." "I know." They processed my request with bureaucratic efficiency, had me sign forms acknowledging the risks, had me confirm I wasn't being coerced, had me designate any possessions I wanted to leave behind for recycling. I left them my journal, asked them to archive it somewhere. They said they would, but I didn't believe them. I spent my last night in the vault, lying in my bunk, thinking about everything and nothing. About the person I had been when I first entered this place, about the person I had become, about whether there was any continuity between those two selves, or if the vault had replaced me entirely with someone else. Morning came. They woke me early and brought me to the entrance. A small group had gathered not to see me off, I realized, but to witness that the procedure was being followed, that I was really leaving, that there would be one less person consuming resources. The overseer was there. She approached me as they were preparing the door. "I'm sorry it came to this," she said. I looked at her, at this woman who had made impossible choices in an impossible situation, and I didn't know what to feel. Anger, pity, understanding. "Me too," I said finally. They gave me a pack with supplies, 2 days of water, 3 days of rations, a radiation counter that looked pre-war and possibly non-functional, a rebreather mask, a flashlight. Then they opened the door. The stairs stretched upward into darkness, and I couldn't see what waited at the top. Couldn't see whether Tomas had been right or wrong about what existed on the surface. I looked back at the vault one last time, at the assembled faces watching me with their hollow eyes and gaunt features, at the overseer standing apart, her expression carefully neutral, at the security officers ready to seal the door behind me, at the tomb I was leaving. I started climbing. The stairs went on forever. My legs burned, my lungs heaved, but I kept moving upward. Behind me, I heard the vault door seal with a heavy thunk of finality. No going back now. Only forward. Only up. The darkness gradually lightened. Not much, but enough that I could make out the stairs beneath my feet without the flashlight. The air changed too, becoming cooler, less recycled. I climbed until I reached a platform. Another door. This one had a manual release, a large wheel that required both hands to turn. I set down my pack and gripped the wheel. It didn't move at first, frozen by rust or age or something else, but I kept trying, throwing all my diminished weight into it, and finally it began to turn. The seal broke with a hiss of equalizing pressure. I pushed the door open and stepped through. The wasteland stretched before me. Gray earth, dead trees, ruined buildings in the distance, sky the color of old bruises. But it was real. It was vast. It was something other than the vault's endless corridors and recycled air and mathematics of scarcity. I stood there breathing it in the wasteland, the radiation, the possibility, and I didn't know if I would survive an hour or a day or somehow manage to find something sustainable. But I was choosing. I was acting. I was refusing to be reduced to numbers in someone else's equation. I shouldered my pack and started walking, away from the vault, toward whatever came next. Behind me, the door sealed itself automatically. Locked, final. I didn't look back. The vault would go on without me, would continue its calculations, its protocols, its slow consumption of itself, would survive or collapse according to variables I was no longer part of. And I would find out what else survived, what else was possible, what existed beyond the boundaries of the only world I had known. I walked until the vault entrance disappeared behind me, swallowed by distance and the gray landscape. I walked until my legs couldn't carry me further, and then I sat on a piece of rubble and drank from my water ration and watched the bruised sky. I thought about writing in my journal, but I had left it behind. My documentation of the vault's descent would stay buried with the vault, unread and unremembered. This was new. This required no documentation, just experience, just breath and movement and the terrifying freedom of uncertainty. I sat there until my strength returned enough to continue. Then I stood and chose a direction at random and kept walking. The wasteland opened before me, empty and indifferent, and I walked into it, hungry and afraid and more alive than I had been in months.